So we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, wherever you're connecting from. A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining. The title of today's webinar is Making UN Premises and Facilities Accessible Through the Business Operation Strategy, and it's a very passionate topic for everybody joining, as well as for us, in order to not only advance the 2030 agenda, but also make true to the promise of leaving no one behind. I will go over a few housekeeping suggestions before we get started. You can go ahead and open the closed captions if necessary on the bottom right-hand corner of your Microsoft Teams. Feel free to use the chat box at any moment. Throughout the webinars, we will be monitoring and answering any questions that you may have, as well as we will have a Q&A session at the end, so that you can also raise your hand and ask a live question. We will also be sharing a feedback form at the end, as well as the recording and the slides on a follow-up email. I think that's about it for housekeeping. My name is Luis Diego Cobb. I'm from the DCO Country Business Strategy, and together with Roberta Martins, we'll be moderating this webinar today. I'll go over the agenda quickly and introduce the distinguished speakers and guests that we have today joining, as well as many other disability experts that have been joining to support this common services through the BOS. So we won't go so much in the introduction of the high impact services. We've done that in the other webinars. We'll skip that part. We'll go directly into the UNDIS, the UN Disability Strategy, and Amy Farkas, who is a consultant at DCO supporting the disability inclusion strategy there. We'll share how these common services fit into not only the UNDIS, but also the accountability framework. We will then go into the implementation of these common services through the BOS, who Roberta Martin, Program Management Officer from DCO, will be sharing. And then we'll hear the experiences from UNICEF. We will hear from Anna Budlayeva, Program Officer, Children with Disabilities from UNICEF, as well as Stefan Tromel, Senior Disability Specialist at ILO. And then we'll have Q&A. As you have seen, we've extended the time up until 7:15 New York time, so that's an hour and 15 minutes of the webinar, so that you can ask more questions and any other comments that you may have. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Amy Farkas. Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Luis Diego. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's my pleasure to be with you on behalf of DCO and the EOSG Disabilities team. As some of you may already know, Luis Diego, you can go to the next slide. As some of you already know, the Secretary General launched the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy in June 2019 to address a lack of system-wide coordination and strategy on disability inclusion. This is important because 15% of the population are people with disabilities. That's more than 1 billion people. So it's quite a significant population. And if we do not take concrete steps to address 15% of the population, we will not be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we really don't want to leave no one behind, the issue of physical accessibility, which we're talking about today, is fundamental. So the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, or UNDIS as we call it for short, includes both a policy and an accountability framework. The policy outlines the high-level commitment of the UN to disability inclusion. The accountability framework is like the teeth of the policy, and it has two aligned components. The first is the Entity Accountability Framework, which is implemented and reported on by UN entities. And the second is a UN country team accountability scorecard on disability inclusion. And that's what applies to UNCTs, and therefore that's the one that we'll be focusing on today and most relevant to our discussion. Now, the strategy covers both programs and operations, with a major focus on the operations side. It's also important to highlight that UNDIS, or the strategy, is interlinked and has synergies with all other UN system priorities, for example, gender, youth, and Indigenous persons with disabilities, or Indigenous persons, not with disabilities necessarily, but sometimes. The next slide, Luis Diego. So I'd like to walk you through, I'd like to give you an overview, basically, of the UNCT Accountability Scorecard on Disability Inclusion. There are 4 core areas. So the first area is leadership, strategic planning, and management. And under that, we have an indicator on leadership, whether senior management is incorporating disability inclusion into their work and promoting it internally and externally. We have strategic planning, whether the CCAs are incorporating disability inclusion. We have indicator 3, which is looking at the cooperation framework and whether that incorporates disability inclusion. Indicator 4 looks at UNCT setup and coordination. In the second core area, which is inclusiveness, it begins with this consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities, which is a foundational element of the strategy. Then it moves to the accessibility of UN premises and accommodation, which we will be talking about heavily today. It also is focused on inclusive procurement of goods and services, which will relate to our conversation today as well. The third core area is programming. And there we look at joint programs and whether they're addressing disability inclusion, data, monitoring and evaluation, and humanitarian action. And the fourth core area is organizational culture, where we look at employment. Are we accessible? Are we recruiting? Are we onboarding? Are we providing all that is necessary to employ people with disabilities? Are we an inclusive organization? Then it's an indicator on capacity development for staff. Are we providing trainings, opportunities? And then communications. And that's looking at whether our communications are disability inclusive. Now, for each indicator, there are benchmarks on a progressive scale covering approaches requirements, meets requirements, exceeds requirements. And this is very similar to the gender swap or the system-wide action plan, if you're familiar with that. UNCT's report on implementation of the strategy through the UN SDG Information Management System, or IMS for short, by the end of each calendar year. And we've had our first round of reporting for 2020. There are technical guidance notes and reporting templates available to help facilitate UNCTs with implementation of UNDIS and reporting. Next slide, Luis Diego, please. So today, let's get back to the topic of physical accessibility. Physical or accessibility is a prerequisite for the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the strategy promotes both the accessibility of UN premises and services for all staff and constituents. Accessibility in today's context refers to when people with disabilities are able to reach, enter, circulate, and use a facility, program, or service, and on an equal basis with others and with dignity and safety. So we're talking about facilities, but also OICT structures, or being able to reach, enter, and use websites, for example. When talking about accessibility, we need to be familiar with this concept of universal design. Universal design essentially means ensuring that a service, a product, or program can be used by all people to the greatest extent possible, including people with disabilities, and that's without reconfiguration or modification. So I encourage you to look up universal design, Google it, learn more about it. It has 7 principles that are very helpful in all different kinds of our work, both planning, operations, even programming. And what's important is that universal design enhances accessibility. So to give you an example of universal design, when you consider your mobile phone, both Android and iOS phone, there is a software or a feature which is embedded, and it's the voiceover feature, for example, and that one is standard. So it's universally applied, or it's universally available to individuals that need it. But for people who are blind, this can be very helpful and very important. But now that it's a universal design feature, it's available to all. The accessibility indicator also talks about reasonable accommodation. And that is essentially adjustments for specific individuals with disabilities. Now, these accommodations may or may not have a financial cost. And using a similar example to before, an example of an accommodation would be acquiring or purchasing screen readers or special screen reading software for the computer of someone who's blind. That is something that's not automatically available on the computer, so that would be a reasonable accommodation for someone who's blind to request. The accessibility indicator also looks at inclusive procurement, and we need to be sure that we're not creating new or additional barriers when we procure services and goods. If we do, we won't be able to address disability inclusion in a systematic manner. It also links, this indicator also links to the employment of staff with disabilities. And when the SG launched the UNDIS, he made it clear that he wanted the UN to be an employer of choice for people with disabilities. And if we want people with disabilities to be part of the UN as staff or consultants, even interns and volunteers, we need to ensure that the premises, the websites, our communications, our OICT infrastructure are all accessible. And finally, and very importantly, there's a foundational concept here, which we need to consult with people with disabilities in the representative organizations. The disability movement has a foundational model called nothing about us without us. And it's really important to bring these communities into our work. They know the situation best. And at the UN, we often don't have all the technical expertise that we need in-house, particularly on physical accessibility. But they will, and they can support us and partner with us and teach us and tell us what it is that's most important. They can also help build our capacity, as I mentioned, but also the awareness on accessibility and many, many other aspects of disability inclusion. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to see if my colleague Gopal Mitra, Senior Social Affairs Officer in the Executive Office of the Secretary General, would like to add any comments. Over to you, Gopal.
No, Amy, thank you. That was great. Happy to join you to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Gopal, as well, and we'll look forward to hearing you in the Q&A. For now, then, I would like to hand over to Roberta Martins to talk to us about the different common services that you can implement through the business operations strategy to make your premises accessible. Roberta, over to you.
Thank you, Luis Diego. I was trying to get access to the presentation.
See if you can access it now.
Okay, I'll try it again. Just a minute. Okay. So if you can see my screen now. Okay. So from the DCO side, from the country business strategy section, why are we here today? Because we would like to have the BOS, the business operations strategy, to be one of the enablers of the disability inclusion strategy. And we have added to our BOS platform some disability inclusive common services that you can use as part of your BOS. So they are mainly divided into three areas: physical accessibility, ICT and digital accessibility, and inclusive HR services. Later in June, we should be talking about other of those areas as part of our webinars on high impact services. But today, as Amy has mentioned, we are going to concentrate more on the physical accessibility. So when it comes to fiscal accessibility, what we are proposing as part of the BOS is that, first of all, as part of our stock take, we conduct this accessibility assessment of the existing premises. So this is the moment where we find out, we map what we have in our premises in terms of accessibility and what is lacking in our buildings in terms of accessibility. And something that is very important at this stage, as Amy has mentioned, is to use the expertise of organizations of persons with disabilities, and also to assess our staff, because sometimes we may have someone at the office with some specific needs for reasonable accommodation, and this person may have never disclosed this need because of the stigma. So it's very important that we assess our staff, that we get in contact with the experts from the organizations of people with disabilities to make sure that we have a complete mapping of our premises. And if I may add a personal example to what Amy was saying in terms of knowing better what are the needs. I come from a national office in Brazil, UNESCO Brasilia office. And we were very proud because we were making some adjustments in our building. So we had the ramps, we had the accessible rooms, and the accessible toilet. But the first time we need to use this accessible toilet, we found out that we had a 2 centimeters tap just in front of the toilet. I wouldn't say that was not allowing the access, but it was making more difficult for the person to use it. So we need to have this perception of people with person with disabilities to make sure that we are doing the right changes, the right accessibility in our buildings. So when we have this mapping, which is part of our stock take for those that are more acquainted to the BOS, next step is to identify the opportunities that we may have in terms of physical accessibility of our premises. And there is this classification of levels 1, 2, and 3 on the accessibility, and each of them they make reference to different levels of implementation of this accessibility. So level 1 is the minimum requirement that we need for our premises wherever we are, which starts with the accessible entrance, an accessible evacuation exit, at least 1 parking space, 1 accessible meeting room, 1 unisex toilet, 1 accessible workstation. And if the common areas at the stage at level 1, they are not mandatory, but it's something that we want to achieve at the end of level 3. And when we mean accessible meeting room, for instance, we mean that it has to be accessible not only from the door to inside, but from the entrance of the building until the accessible evacuation. So it's fully accessible room, meeting room that we need in this level 1 of physical accessibility. This is to give you a little bit of what we are planning to do in terms of BOS. So we have this reference of the stock take and the reference to international documents. As Amy was saying, we have those universal standards that should be taken into account when planning what we need in terms of physical accessibility in our offices. This will be included as part of your BOS. And I'll try to share with you the BOS platform to show you that, in fact, we are planning, we are including as part of the BOS those services and also some guidance on how to implement them at the country level. So, because as Amy was saying, we normally don't have this expertise at the country level, at the UN level. So we might need some support to make sure that we are able to implement those services. So now when we go to the BOS platform, as part of the stock take, administration services, which include the premises management. When you go to premise management, you have now the accessibility services indicated as highly recommended. So most of the countries right now, they have completed their BOS transition or BOS preparation in the platform, the BOS 2.0. But it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to start implementing the physical accessibility from now on. You might start working with your OMT on the mapping of existing physical accessibility in the premises, even starting some work in terms of level 1 physical accessibility. And when it comes the time for the annual review, you should include this as part of your BOS. But don't wait for the annual review to start working with accessibility, because this, and Gopal may agree on what I'm saying, we are lagging behind in terms of implementing this in many of our premises at the country level. So here you have the description of what does it mean, the inclusion of those services. So accessible, level 1 accessibility, you have here. And also if you come to the library, you have some guidance here on how to implement those services. Oh, they're not appearing here. Sorry for that. Let me check. Yeah. Okay, so you have here the practical notes on physical accessibility, on ICT accessibility, on inclusive HR. So your OMT have some guidance on the BOS platform, but again, don't miss the opportunity of using the expertise of organizations of persons with disabilities at your country, because those are the main resources that we may count on, and also take advantage of the existing experiences that we have in the system, as we are going to see very soon in this today during the presentation. So coming back to the presentation itself, and yeah. This should be part of our BOS, and also when we include this as part of the BOS, we are going to support also the reporting on how much we are advancing in terms of physical accessibility at the UN premises. So as I mentioned to you, if you have a BOS which is under development, you can include this as part of your BOS right now. If your BOS is completed, is sign off, you can include it as part of your BOS review, which doesn't prevent you to start working from now on. Something that you may ask is about the funding of that. From the studies that we have, we found out that from $20,000, and UNICEF will also show us less than this, we can start working with level 1 of premises accessibility. But also take into account that we might go for partner collaboration, meaning requesting support from partners at the country level. Many countries have governmental secretariats, departments taking care of this issue. We have sometimes partners in our buildings or other entities occupying the same buildings that we can discuss with them the possibility of collaborating to make our premises more accessible. So those are some suggestions to start implementing from now on the physical accessibility of our premises. Without further delay, I would like to give the floor to our colleagues from UNICEF to share their experience on implementing the accessibility in their offices. Over to you, Luis Diego.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I think this makes it very practical how to implement it through the BOS, and we'll probably have some follow-up questions. So Anna Burlayeva is going to be sharing UNICEF's part. Anna, over to you to learn about your experiences and thank you for your support. These levels that we're suggesting on the BOS are from UNICEF's model and from the support that they provided on physical accessibility. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Luis Diego. I noticed they're from UNICEF. Roberto, thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I will skip some of mine because you covered many things. Would you help me with the slides, please? I think you have access. So next slide, please. Colleagues, thank you so much for joining. It's great to see that numbers keep rising. I would not be speaking a lot because I would like to leave time for Q&A, but to give you a flavor of what system do we have in UNICEF with regards to ensuring physical accessibility. So I will give you some background and well as talk about the system that we have in place and how to ensure the sustainability of it, as well as share some results. Next slide, please. So in terms of the background, it's important to highlight that it's all started in 2011 when we had a first executive directive on inclusive employment. And the same year, disability section was established. So it's the first time we had a dedicated team working on disability and that would support programs as well as operations. So in 2015, we had a commitment to become more climate neutral. And the idea was how can we combine climate with the other concept that might be still new. So accessibility was this great hook. So as a next step, we established the Green Accessibility Fund. That this fund actually, the way it operates, it's a 3% of surcharge from the air travel. Co-funds 2% goes to reduce carbon emission and 1% goes to improving accessibility of UNICEF premises. So, but this is not all in the background because it's all look good in the concept, but another challenge that we had is actually, of course, advocacy, right? So how do you change culture and how do you convince everyone that this is needed? So there was many things done in a parallel. We also had a survey on staff with disabilities within UNICEF. We backed it up with a lot of the data on the programs and also with the idea that we cannot be inclusive in our programs unless we kind of take care of our house. So another thing was, of course, building our programs, we need to consult with persons with disabilities and we need to ensure that our premises are accessible to have these consultations. So next slide, please. Thank you. So with that being said, we have kind of 4 main pillars of building accessible physical UNICEF that is accessible, UNICEF premises that are accessible. So also in advocacy, one component was do not think that it is only for persons with disabilities, right, or for staff with disabilities, but it's for all of us. And a great example was I was a few years back. When we still could travel, I was in a field mission in Hyderabad, India, and the colleague who met me first with a hug, actually, she just broke her leg, and she said, we met level on accessibility that requires to have accessible workstation. And it was great because now I'm actually moved from my 2nd floor office to the 1st floor, and I have the entire office for myself. So it's really important for everyone. As Gopal and Amy highlighted, universal design is a key. So whatever we do, really thinking about how it benefits everyone and to build also in our advocacy and in our culture change. So those 4 pillars, of course, funding, then as a dedicated support, then procedure and quality control. So on the funding, we started with the applications for $50,000 as a maximum for country offices, and we had 2 rounds per year. And the way it was done, rounds would open and countries would apply, and they would have specific needs. What we learned through the years, that 50,000 might be a lot for someone, but not enough for everyone. To give you a simple example, to adjust the entrances, we would receive requests, very similar adjustments from the beginning would be from 4,000 in some cases to 28 or 48,000 different cases. So how this function is changing now, we're planning to increase this fund upon the request. So then the support, of course, we had a dedicated team within the Division of Finance and Administration, as well as support of disability section. We built in a very easy portal where people can access it and see all information. We also had some campaigns, like green campaigns, that would also highlight the accessibility. We had a newsletter that would come out quarterly and still are. Then we had a cyber walkthrough. So in some countries had challenges finding the expertise in accessibility. So one of the solution was, it's not a solution, but one of the options was as a first step to do the cyber walkthrough with the camera. But the main principle was consult with local organizations, persons with disabilities. And as we saw, this really changed the approach also to operations, right? So it's really, everything is really interlinked. Then, of course, reporting. Reporting was one of the requirements per year. So procedures, then we had a procedure on efficiency and accessibility that was revised in 2020. And quality control. So in the quality control, we had a technical cards on physical accessibility that had a very simple, and Gapalos worked on it actually. We had very simple steps on what is required for each level with the drawings. That was really helpful. But some things were still missing there, because as we know, many offices are rented, long lease. So now we are working on accessibility toolkit, that's called accessibility toolkit, universal design for physical accessibility for programs and premises. So this toolkit will be more comprehensive, and it will be available publicly. We're planning to launch it in September, and I'll share with all of you. Thank you. Next step, please. Thank you. I would not talk much about levels because Roberta covered this perfectly. Just tell you one thing, that this is not a kind of set in stone process. We learn as we go. For example, under level 1 accessibility, the requirement is accessible workstation. Many country offices felt like they're not meeting this requirement because the explanation that was make sure that the door width is accessible and wider, make sure that we have a furniture that could be adjusted. So in some zone offices had a feedback that it might not be very easy for them. Therefore, we're just changing the language, right? Having a better explanation of accessible office or office on the first floor and easily located close to the accessible restroom facility entrance. So thinking through. Also, level 3, for example, when we talk about evacuation and warning systems, we know that some country offices have only sound, but it's important to have as well as a sound, as well as a flashing light. So this is another thing another step we're thinking to adjust in level 3. So again, I would encourage you all who are using those levels to really get the feedback from countries and see how things could be adjusted. Really difference between country office and zone office. We also recently had this sort of, in order for us to also to promote these levels, not to raise awareness, we created this special sort of labels that will be used for on public facing websites of each country office, depending which level they meet, as well as in the lobby. So this gives another sort of additional advocacy pitch. Yes, so this is the levels. Next step, please. Thank you. So with regards to results, on results, yes, another thing on sustainability I wanted to mention that really helps UNICEF is to have an indicator. We had an indicator in SP to reach by 2021, 50% of country offices to meet level 1 accessibility. So as of now, we are on 49%, and we will meet this target. So I encourage everyone to think about accountability. Maybe it will be minimum, but really to think that it should be in your strategic plans. So as of now, we are on 49%. 36 country offices received funding, and up until 2019. In 2020, we have 4 country offices received funding, but they didn't report on the progress yet. That's why it's not here. Indirect impact. Of course, there is more interest from UNV offices we see right now. This year, 17 UNICEF offices applied for the UNVs. We also hear countries reporting more on engagement with OPDs. Of course, this is links to the programs as well. And request support for diverse programs, projects. And another indirect impact, we have focal points on disability that not necessarily expert on disability. Well, before some of them were only working on inclusive education, for example. Now they're working closely with chief operations and to actually thinking about their own house, their own facilities. So this is definitely, another add-on that is people gaining more knowledge, expertise, and really ownership of this these initiatives. Next, please. I'll share with you some examples. But before talking about the example, I will also mention some of the challenges. So you saw this number, 36 country offices. Out of the 36 country offices, it's about 32 country offices and 4 zone offices. So what we've seen right now in zone offices, because there are smaller offices, advocacy is not as strong. The funding also, the way information is distributed, it's not always there, not always priority. So we see this as one of the challenges and one of our priorities for this year, actually work with the zone offices. So while before countries would apply, now we can reach out using the special database that we have. So we can actually reach out to country offices, encouraging them to apply to the fund, providing them support with the standards, levels, as well as technical support when required. So this example I really like because as one UN, we have many common promises. So in UNICEF Armenia in 2019 applied for the funds to build a disability-friendly elevator. So for these funds, we get back to them saying this is actually common promises. Therefore, advocate with other UN agencies, let them chip in. That's exactly what's happened. UNDP, WFP, as well as UNHCR also chipped in, and as a result, in November 2019, they had accessible elevator that would take staff to the canteen. So it was a great example of joint promises. And I think we should also do more of this as a part of the One UN, and definitely UNDIS will help with this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So those just a few examples, and you can see the difference in the prices, right? The difference in the cost of the making premise accessible. UNICEF Belarus made a ramp as well as adjusted minibus. Then in India, you can see here many many adjustments and with the entrance, parking, bathrooms. And in an example from UNICEF China, there is accessible restrooms as well as ramps to the entrance. Next slide, please. So I also want to highlight to you that 2020, as we know, it was a challenging year. So what we've done this year was also a year of opportunities. So during 2020, we provided 11 evacuation chairs, and I'm sorry, this is a typo in the typo here. So 11 evacuation chairs to country offices. And this was also a good example because what we received the request for need. That's why we are adjusting our levels, because this is another component that seemed important and country office want to implement this. And it is, most cases, it's not so difficult to procure locally. So all these 11 chairs were procured locally. Thank you. I think that's it from my side, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and we also look forward to hearing from you in a little bit. Before that, I would like to hand over to Stefan Tromel from ILO, who's Senior Disability Advisor. Stefan?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, good early morning for those of you who are based in New York. I will share very briefly the experience of the ILO, especially in our headquarters. We are much less advanced in our office, and we're definitely much less advanced in terms when compared to where UNICEF is. No? Definitely, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy is giving us a lot of leverage to promote and promote accessibility throughout our organization. We are about to adopt an ILO disability inclusion policy and multi-year strategy, which mirrors the UN disability UNDIS accountability framework, and of course has a specific focus on the accessibility of our premises, both headquarter and the field. And one of the indicators that we will be having is how many offices are meeting basic accessibility standards. And we have not yet defined the level of and that we're going to do this year. So this year we should know, by the end of this year, we should know the current status, how many of our offices are meeting already now accessibility standards. Some do, most not. But also the legal status of the office, is it shared premises? Do we own it? Is it rented? Because all that has an implication. And hopefully then by the end of the year we'll be able to establish a target for the next 2 years. I'm saying that because I think we need to think about accessibility as a process. No? If you think about accessibility in a specific office, you can always do better over time. And every year you should think, okay, let's reserve some amount of our budget to additional accessibility elements. But also, if you look at it as an organization like ILO, like UNICEF, you might have very different situations. You might have a headquarter which is very accessible, and you might have field offices which are in very different situations. Now, so all in all, you need to see it both as a process within a specific location, but also as an organization. I think it's also important to take advantage of initiatives like when you're renting a new place, when you're building something. In the ILO, we are currently have been ongoing for many years a renovation process, and it has been very interesting to see how accessibility has increasingly featured as a key element in our building and renovation process. And we have now many more. We have accessible toilets on every of our 10 floors. We have almost every of our meeting rooms is now pretty well accessible in terms of a ramp to the podium, specific places or the possibility for people on wheelchairs sitting in different parts of the room, hearing loops in most of the rooms. We have now a good set of evacuation chairs also, and the ones that Anna just showed in the UNICEF presentation. And we're also interesting to see how we are currently redesigning our security perimeter in the ILO. And it was also interesting to see how that needs to take into account accessibility conditions. A budget, of course, is always needed in the context of accessibility. But as experience has shown, when accessibility is featured at the outset of a construction or a renovation, the extra cost is really minimal. But it's very important to define priorities. No, I think as I said, if you see it as a process, well, engage in a discussion, sometimes with external organizations. Sometimes if you have staff with disabilities, of course, they will provide a perfect sounding board for you. Try to define priorities and put budget to these priorities. Partnership is a key issue, as has already been mentioned before. Accessibility is not a rocket science. I mean, let's be clear. Some issues are more complex than others, but normally it's a pretty straightforward process. But it's always good to have the advice from disability organizations and accessibility experts, who usually would also be able to provide the most effective solutions, which usually imply not a huge cost. It's very important. I'm a disability specialist in the ILO. I'm not an accessibility expert. Right now, our real accessibility expert is the head of our facilities team. He has become gradually a top expert on accessibility. He knows everything about accessibility standards in Switzerland and all that. I must admit, I have very little clue about that. And he's really become, and I think that is key for success of this. He's become our accessibility champion in the organization, like we have similar champions in other departments. What he does not normally need my advice or the advice of the team that I had, because as I said, he's the expert on the issue. The support that he might sometimes require is a bit of political support. If he is sort of discussing with other colleagues about this new perimeter of the ILO, he is pushing for accessibility, and sometimes he needs my additional push to remind the colleagues that are involved in that project that accessibility should feature as an important element in that in that context. But at the same time, also sometimes he wants to check with me when there are different possible solutions available. He wants to see which is the solution that not only is effective, but probably is also the more elegant or disability inclusive solution. No? And the example that comes to mind, he's currently looking at the solution to make our cinema in the ILO accessible. It's a rather old room with a very high podium. It's absolutely impossible right now for a person on a wheelchair or even on crutches to go up there. And there's basically two options. One is to put a lift from the ground floor to the podium, and one is to have a ramp going from the entrance of this room, which is a room that, like other cinemas, it goes a bit down. He could easily put a ramp that would take persons directly from the entrance of the room to the podium. And we both agreed that the second solution is a much more elegant solution, the solution probably that will be used by almost everybody wanting to go on the podium, and it takes away from a solution that is sort of a more disability-specific solution. It also might have even other technical considerations. The last point I just want to make also is the issue about information about accessibility. It's very important not to forget that dimension. It was very interesting to see what Anna has just shown about the different labels and levels and all that. But it's also very important that all our colleagues know about the accessibility solutions that exist. We have sometimes organized meetings in our premises, and when people say, well, yeah, but where's the accessible toilet? Well, we were all sort of looking at each other saying, well, sorry, I just forgot right now where the accessible toilet is. No? So I think it's also it's that element is also important. And the final message which in fact I wanted to say at the very beginning, it's very important. Accessibility is very important to allow for the employment of staff with disabilities, etc., etc. But I think it's also very important in terms of our image. What image are we giving as UN if a person on a wheelchair comes to our premises and sees that he or she cannot get into our building or cannot get into a meeting room? It clearly sends a message that we were not thinking of you, that we're not considering you as part of the population that we address. I think that is a situation that no longer is acceptable, and I think that is, I would say, that the beauty of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, really trying to make the UN not only an employer of choice, but also really trying to sort of meet this challenge of leave no one behind. But with Devo, I think I leave it here, and happy to answer any comments or questions. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And I think also very useful, all the things that you were saying, particularly that this is a journey and it should be gradual, but it should start now. Something that we mentioned yesterday was not to wait for your BOS annual review to start including this and start putting these services in your physical premises, but to start as soon as possible. So we'll start with the Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions at this moment. We'll also address some other questions that were in the chat box as well. I see that Pamela has her hand raised. Pamela, let me see if you can unmute yourself. Pamela, over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Luis and colleagues. Very interesting. And I think it's, there are just a few, I'm sorry, this is a bit scattered, but a few things as you all went along with your presentations that I just wanted to drop on. One of them, and I really echo what Kevin's message about the presentations. I noticed also that in the graphics of, I think it was the first presentation, all the graphics were related to physical disabilities, so wheelchairs and walking, canes and things of this nature. And I think we do forget how to sometimes bring into our products. How do we reflect that whole range? And I can't say I have a solution of how to reflect some of these issues, but I just think it's something that we need to figure out, because in a country like Afghanistan, we have probably most of those who need our support and services the most may be illiterate. And therefore the visual for those who are able to use the visuals are very important. I just wanted to comment also, I mean, we have a slightly different situation here, perhaps than other countries, in that we have a very large humanitarian programming. So we have a large humanitarian country team. And part of that team are several NGOs who are focused on disabilities. And so we just today or yesterday had a meeting of this new working group for disabilities. It is housed within the humanitarian country team process. So to bring it across the board and really get everyone thinking about it within the UN country team, we are including the OMT co-chairs, and the chairs of all of our various working groups will become members of that working group, so that they can bring that that conversation back into their own spheres. The other thing is that obviously with the cooperation framework and the Leave No One Behind, we will be looking at emphasizing this as well. And the chairs, there are 4 co-chairs, actually, of the working group, and 2 are from civil society, local civil society, and 2 from the UN, ILO, and probably UNFPA. I think overall, though, for me, having worked in mission environments quite a bit, there are going to be limitations to how much they are willing to change these things, and this is going to be the battle. But I think to get it that way, I think we have to just get this thinking into the DNA, if you will. It has to be helping people see the environment in that inclusive manner, so that they are looking at it through the eyes of anybody that has to engage in that environment. I mean, I mentioned the fact that there are a lot of things like bright lights or loud noises that someone, for myself, are very stressful. So it took me a while to convince them that I really didn't want them to replace the light bulbs in my room. Thank you very much. Didn't have to explain to them why, but you know, it's this gradual education that everyone has the right to create the environment in which they can work best. And we need to see how to accommodate that process. And so I'm faced now with us building a new office, but I don't have a footprint that allows for some of these things like lifts and the like. And it will be a 2-story building, and I am not quite sure how we're going to deal with this, because the conference room is going to be on the 2nd floor, whether I like it or not, because the bosses are going to be sitting on the ground level. So we're trying to figure out what we can do in that regard, see how we can have, I don't know, I haven't figured it out yet, to be quite honest, but the planning, the footprint I'm given does not take into account the need for access planning. And I think that's something that, you know, they have engineers and architects, and it's still not something they understand how to plan for. I can't give them the measurements, you know. So I think it is something that is going to take quite some time, and I'm hoping that this building could become an example for others in the compound to start making their adaptations, because all of this is built assuming physical abilities to climb stairs, to etc. So I think it is an interesting discussion, and I'm hoping we can figure that out with this building as sort of a model for others to follow. Even the new ICU they just built has some access issues. So you know, I think it's just not in the DNA. It's not an automatic for anyone yet. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think I'll let the speakers address this. Anna, you had your hand raised, and then we can hear from the other panelists as well.
Thank you, Luis Diego. Pamela, fantastic questions, really. Thank you for this. And you raised the challenges that I would say most of us face. I will start with the topics such as you mentioned the sound as well as the lights. So what UNDIS does, I think it really brings up this system-wide approach, right? So in some cases, we are talking about reasonable accommodation. So that's what we see, and we see this with some of our colleagues. We actually adjusting the office or specifically to meet the requirements of the staff member or volunteer or consultant. In the other cases, what we do a lot, work with the ICT office, right? Because many things are procured through them. So we create a specific guidance on the standards, very simple, for the audio system in the conference room to be more clear, to have less noise, like things like that. There are still, of course, there will be still challenges because the quality assurance is still a key, so we're still dealing with this, but at least there is a sort of blueprint where country offices can see and where to buy this and what's the requirements for the supplies for the conference rooms. So thank you, excellent question. The other thing I just want to highlight to you, and I'll be happy to share the email address of our colleague who used to be a part of a DFAM HQ, who actually worked with us on the levels and technical cards, and he just became the chief of office in Afghanistan, Kandahar. He's excellent, William Abdullah, and he'll be happy to support you as well. And in fact, our country office in Afghanistan became accessible as well. So, and I'll share with you some materials that we have that will hopefully help you with having a sort of standards and accessibility, as well as, of course, our advice is find local OPDs if not also engage experts, engineers and architects, maybe from the global level, who could oversee the work. But I totally understand your challenges, and we experience this a lot, especially if the building is leased or rental. So I'm happy to support with those tasks. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Do any of the other panelists want to say anything? Roberta, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just to add on what Anna was saying, and I think Pamela made a very important point in terms of common premises. And I also saw a question from British at the chat box on the same issue. Just would like to highlight that we are launching very soon. We are rolling out the common premises strategy, and the TTCP, the task team on common premises, they have also included physical accessibility as part of the screening of the plan of the new common premises. So this is something that it's been taken care, and those and the requirements are based on the universal design standards. And we are planning to take into consideration all the aspects. I saw some questions about blind, about deaf colleagues. So this is also it's something that is also being addressed as part of the new strategy for common premises. And something that I forgot to mention when I was making my presentation, physical accessibility is part of a larger concept. So we have the two other pillars that we were showing earlier today on ICT accessibility and on inclusive HR. And we need the three of them to be implemented at the same time. We cannot have just one of them implemented. We need the three of them implemented at the same time, in one complementing the other one. Because if we want to walk the talk, if we want to implement the SDGs, if you want to leave no one behind, we have to make sure that not only our stakeholders are able to access our building, but also that our colleagues with any disabilities, they are able to perform their duties at their best capacity with the best tools and requirements that they may need to do this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Gopal, Amy, or Stefan, if you would also like to chime in, or any remarks before moving to the next question.
Yes. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, no, so sorry, Gopal. No, just a couple of questions, a couple of comments also to the question in the chat from Indonesia on the use of sign language. Now, you need to distinguish between the deaf community and the hard of hearing community. So deaf people usually their main forms of communication is through their national sign language. So normally, if you would be organizing a UN meeting in a country, you would check whether there will be participants that are deaf, and that you probably should provide interpretation into the national sign language. And that would apply also to a virtual meeting. Normally, when we in ILO organize virtual meetings right now, we always would have sign language interpretation as part of it. But we would also provide captioning, because for people that are hard of hearing, they would usually not be familiar with sign language, and they would either use captions, so they would read what is being said, or sometimes they would also require a hearing loop. So you have different solutions for different groups. The issue that was raised, I think, from Pamela about the signing is very important. I think it's important to to make sure that the information is easily to understood, so that people can easily navigate a building and find, for instance, the accessible toilets or other things. I was a bit not dismayed, but disappointed by this example of these new premises where they've already decided that they will have two levels, where the meeting room is on the second floor and where there's no access to that. No, I think we need to do better on that. No, because I think that we have a huge opportunity. we need to make sure that accessibility requirements are part of the checklist for any new building that we are constructing, that we are renting, that we are buying. Because if we continue to allow for non-accessible premises, we will never finish the job. No? The job is already heavy with all the current buildings in which we are located, which are not accessible yet. If we continue to allow for new buildings not to meet accessibility criteria, I think that is a bad example. If you have a meeting room on the second floor and the second floor is not accessible, you're basically not expecting neither a visitor with a physical disability, nor are you expecting that a staff member will attend that meeting. And I think it just gives a clear message of exclusion, oversight, and we don't care about a certain part of the population to which we should serve. I think we need to be stricter and not allow for these situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Gopal, you also wanted to comment on this?
No, let's go ahead. I mean, there are other questions I can add on to the next question whenever it comes.
Perfect. So I think, Kevin, you had your hand raised. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself. Kevin, can you hear us? Over to you. So you should be able to unmute yourself from your end.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. Hey, thank you very much. What I want to bring up, you saw a little bit in the chat that I popped up a couple things. I am a disabled staff. I work for the I work for the World Food Program, and I'll say this because it gets to my point. I've been with WFP for 22 years, 10 different duty stations, everything from E-class duty stations to A-class duty stations. What I want to bring up, and I don't know if this is the proper environment, but just something that people to keep in the back of their mind is the idea of HR. I've had situations in my career where I've been asked to go to some places that it's just nonsensical to ask me to go, i.e. war zones. Being legally blind, sending somebody who's legally blind to a war zone is just silly. Or, for example, the Ebola crisis, a health emergency that there would be visual cues that I'd miss. I have had issues within my career with HR where I've been asked to go to these places, and when I've said no, it's created problems. At the end of the day, everything is worked out. And again, I've been with WFP for 22 years, et cetera, et cetera. But those things need to be considered as well. And the last point I'll make on this is that only after 15 years of paying into some of the insurances did I find out that I don't get all the payouts if I get injured in like an accident insurance because of my vision. I didn't know these things. I was never briefed on these things. So I've been paying thousands of dollars that I could never get because nobody from HR would explain these things to me when I joined. So it's another thing. I don't think it has anything to do with maybe what we're discussing today, but it is, we need to make sure that those things in HR and hiring and deployments are considered. Over.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think that feedback helps, and that building that network of experiences to be able to grow from that. Gopal, would you like to address this comment?
No, there is, let us be very honest. We can't address these because these are long-term systemic and issues, right? And to be honest, and we realize that, and it's good to acknowledge that, if you see the UN was never geared or set up, or the UN never felt that people with disabilities would work in this organization. I mean, at least till about 5-10 years back, right? So that was more than an exception. It's still an exception, but now we have the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. I remember people, colleagues, not wanting to declare or self-declare their impairment or disability. Because the thought was that we'll be penalized for it or will not be hired for it. We see it slowly changing. As Stefan said, it's a process. And Kevin, I'm also a blind person working in the, not like 22 years, like 9 years, maybe 8.5, 9 years. And I share some of this thing, but what I see is it is slowly changing. Now with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, for example, there is an indicator on employment, which talks about recruiting and retaining and the career development of staff with disabilities. And while developing the technical guidance on that indicator, and exactly the point that Kevin mentioned, we highlighted the issue of mobility. And we are talking about staff mobility, and we are talking about staff, and also let me say there are staff members who have dependents with disabilities. So when we are talking about mobility, those things need to be taken into consideration when we are doing the mobility planning and to be discussed with the particular staff member. So we have a long way to go, but what we see is slowly changes happening, you know, and the strategy provides a framework to have this discussion. Our HR colleagues, they are champions of disability inclusion within our HR, fewer in number, but there are. But overall, there is a long way to go, and but we see some change coming. And there is one point I want to make, and I think we are lucky to have champions like Pamela, who push disability inclusion, and many of you in the countries. It is the diversity among persons with disabilities, and people with disabilities are a very diverse group. What is accessible to a person who is deaf is the opposite. Often what is accessible to a person who is blind. It's very different from a person who's on a wheelchair, and significantly different the person with intellectual or a developmental or a psychosocial disability. You know, so we have to understand that people with disabilities are a diverse group. And today's topic is physical accessibility, which relates more with persons with physical disabilities, some for persons who are blind or who are deaf, but we need to take that into account. And I want to say that, for example, with Department of Global Communications, next month we are launching the Disability Inclusive Communication Guidelines, which will address a lot of the issues of accessibility, some of which Pamela has highlighted, some of which others have highlighted. I see the issue of color contrast. You know, we have been fighting this battle, and we are slowly inching forward. For example, the UN blue, which is our primary color, is not accessible if you compare it to the contrast ratio. So we are talking to a department of colleagues in Department of Global Communications, our branding colleagues, and they are more and more flexible to give us that space to bring in accessibility. But again, there are multitude of things, you know, and we are trying to address them slowly, one by one, slowly. It's a process. And hopefully with support, with the engagement of all of you, we'll be able to make progress. Thank you. I'll hand it over to you, Luis Diego.
Thank you so much, Gopal. And we're almost coming to a close on the webinar, so I'll like to see if any of the panelists would like to make any final remarks, and also comment that some of the questions that were not answered or any follow-up that needs to be done, we will do that afterwards as well. So I would like to start with Stefan, if you would like to end with any remarks.
Well, no, really, I think, well, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for the initiative. It's great to see so many colleagues listening in both yesterday and today. It's a comprehensive framework. I think Gopal has provided. I was just writing to Kevin in the chat, but then Gopal's answer was much better. No, it is a comprehensive framework. Many issues are interconnected, as also as Amy was showing, the different indicators, procurement, resource accommodation, all these things come together. It is a process, but I think in this process, what we need is champions that like. I think it was Pamela was saying, well, champions that sometimes you need to fight with your bosses, with your colleagues. But I think the exciting thing that I've been seeing in the ILO and is that while this started as something that we led as disability team, that we now have a group of champions, a significantly large group of champions, both in headquarters and fields, that really are convinced that this is the way forward, that it's good for the organization, that it's good for them personally and professionally to promote a more inclusive organization. And I think that is really what makes me very, very hopeful that we will be moving ahead in this long process, but I think with a reasonable speed. Back to you.
Thank you, Stefan. Over to Anna Burdayeva, if you would like to make any final comments or remarks.
Thank you so much, Luis Diego. First of all, I want to thank organizers and the participants for having really open discussion, fantastic interventions and great questions as well. And I really felt like it's really one UN approach. We all have similar challenges, but as Gopal highlighted, we do make small steps to progress, and we've seen it. And it's really important to look at not only on one indicator, but really look holistically at all. And to highlight also the funding is extremely important. Tap into what Kevin was saying is many questions, many things could be addressed through reasonable accommodation, right? But again, we need commitment, leadership commitment, funding, awareness raising, culture change, all those components really has to be brought together. Last answer to Parish's question. Some guidance were developed. What the question is, are there any guidelines was developed during the COVID on disability inclusiveness? I will highlight accessibility toolkit that we'll share with all of you in about 2-3 months. We have a specific chapter on inclusive accessibility in humanitarian settings, and that was developed, and a lot of things were reflected during the COVID. So it will be something on it. Thank you so much, all. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. Gopal or Amy, if you would like to comment before we close off on any final remarks.
No, thank you, Luis. One final, it was said before, but colleagues, thank you again. And it is one thing, it has been mentioned, but just wanted to reiterate it, that, consulting or engaging with organizations of persons with disabilities in your country would be, I think, one of the most foundational and critical things to do. It helps in a lot of ways with expertise, with advocacy, with raising the visibility, changing attitudes, and so on. And we are here to support in any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gopal, and thanks everybody for joining. I think, as you all mentioned, this is a journey that is gradual, but we should begin and know that you have a lot of support, a lot of resources available to do that, and together we can leverage our experiences. We hope to see you in the upcoming webinars as well, and we will be sharing any details, the recording and the slide deck as well, and other resources that are available to you. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.